Greetings and welcome back to room 303 at our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now to When I Heard the Learned Astronomer, poem number 7 of the 29 of By the Roadside. Now, there are a number of titles from Leaves of Grass that, before I started giving the Talks with Walt lectures, I already presented some lectures on YouTube, and this is one of those, simply because this is one of the most anthologized poems in all of Leaves of Grass, and I'm going to challenge you to at least watch that set of comments along with my assumptions that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net down that left-hand side, Talks with Walt. Now, in that lecture, I'm going to be more specific to talking about Whitman's pedagogy as I speak of it there, his understanding of learning. You'll remember that Whitman was a teacher, and I've always argued that you really can't read Whitman's stuff without appreciating the fact that he is first and foremost a teacher. We're going to talk about learning. Now, I've been working with you from inscriptions all the way up through a set of introductory comments to By the Roadside, and we just finished with that little poem, Thoughts. Let's hear now what Norton's has to tell us about this poem. He says it this way, Norton says it this way. It was a drum taps poem in the 1865-67, very anthologized piece. In fact, this is one of the most anthologized pieces. Was in the Songs of Parting group of Leaves of Grass in 1871-76 and was included in the present group in 1881. Now, if you've been reading, as we have, all of Leaves of Grass up to this point, this poem is placed remarkably well right in the center of Leaves of Grass to return us again to some of the things that Whitman was saying in advance of this poem. For example, do you remember in Song of Myself, passage 23, he says, hurrah for positive science. Do you remember this? Hurrah for positive science. Your facts are useful. They are not my dwelling. And you'll remember in Song of Myself, passage 1, creeds and schools in abeyance. You'll remember in the opening lines of Song of Myself. But I want to take us really quickly to Song of the Open Road. We've already talked about this in detail, but do you remember this in Song of the Open Road, passage number 6? He says it this way, here is the test of wisdom. Wisdom is not finally tested in schools. Wisdom can't be passed from one having it to another. Not having it, wisdom is of the soul, is not susceptible of proof. We're going to get to the word proof in this poem. Is its own proof, applies to all stages and objects and qualities, and is content. Is the certainty of the reality and immortality of things and the excellence of things, something there is in the flow to the side of things that provokes it out of the soul. We're going to get the word mystical in this poem, and I think very much we're playing right along that same line of thinking. Let's just point out what many scholars have pointed out about the brilliant crafting of this poem. Lines 1 through 4 with this repetition of when, which will of course take us back to Chaucer's opening lines of Canterbury Tales. We've given full lectures of it elsewhere. That when, then construction. Of course, Keats played the same game, when I have fears that I may cease to be. So we're playing around with these when stanzas 1 through 4. And we've got what some have called noisy syllables, 64 of them actually, these noisy syllables. And then in the second part, we'll have in these last lines 50 soft syllables to lead us to this brilliant final line. He says it this way. When I heard the learned astronomer, when the proofs, the figures were arranged in columns before me, when I was shown the charts and diagrams to add, divide, and measure them, when I, sitting, heard the astronomer where he lectured with much applause in the lecture room, how soon unaccountable I became, tired and sick, till rising and gliding out, I wandered off by myself in the mystical moist night air, and from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars. Now, we've been talking about pedagogy, especially since we met the Song of Myself, passage 46, and the way in which Whitman argues that students learn material. Obviously, you can learn by listening, you can learn by lecturing, but as we've seen so often in Leaves of Grass, Whitman is an integral thinker about transcending and including. There's got to be something beyond the lecture. Obviously, our Talks with Walt, I hope, are inspired by this idea. Notice he begins, first of all, when I heard the learned astronomer, and this will take us back to our reading at the very beginning with Eidolons, and I'll just give you a few lines of this just to kind of remind you. All space, all time, the stars, the terrible perturbations of the sun, swelling, collapsing, ending, serving their longer, shorter use, filled with eidolons only. And then how about this one? Beyond the lectures, learned professor, beyond thy telescope or spectroscope, observer keen, beyond all mathematics, beyond the doctor's surgery, anatomy, beyond the chemist with his chemistry, the entities of entities, eidolons. This idea of the learned astronomer, the learned philosopher, there's only so much learning can do for us, can take us so far. Why? Because you'll have proofs, you'll have figures. Obviously, we mentioned the proofs already, ranged in columns before me. Now, there's a reading of this poem that says, it makes sense that it would be in the drum tap section because Whitman is going to try to define the American Civil War as the great dividing war that was seeking to unite. And notice here, we're kind of dividing up the stars, the beauty of the heavens into columns, right? And of course, we could think about military columns as well. When I was shown the charts, the diagrams, to add, divide, measure them, of course, this measure is fascinating, right? Song of Myself, 46, and never will be measured. You'll remember that one. When I sitting, and that's a distinction that I make in my other lecture that I hope you've already watched, the distinction between sitting and walking in this poem. In the opening part of the poem, he's sitting, he's simply passive, he's accepting the information as it's presented to him. He's going to hear the astronomer where he lectures with much applause in the lecture room, that is to say, he's an expert. And we've seen this already. Whitman, the iconoclast. He's always the outsider. He's always the one that's challenging the authority figures by saying, I know that you're, well, it's so Socratic, isn't it? It's Socrates needling poor Thrasymachus, I say poor, at the conclusion of Republic 1, we've talked about it elsewhere, asking those questions of the so-called experts. You'll remember that in Plato's Apology, Socrates will defend himself by saying, well, I was supposedly, according to the Delphi article, I was supposed to be the wisest of the wise, and yet I didn't think I was wise, but I went around asking these learned astronomers who are always getting the applause. Whitman has some problems with that. He tells us, after sitting and just listening, how soon unaccountable, and of course the word unaccountable contains the word count and counting, I became tired and sick. Now this idea of sick is, as I say in a lecture to students, or in the earlier lecture, it's like bored. In other words, so much talking can only lead so far, which is why we are calling, I hope we are calling and understanding our conversations with all his talks with Walt. That is to say, it can't just be about me talking. There's got to be that engagement with the text till he says, I'd had enough. Rising and gliding. Notice the brilliance of the word gliding, the gracefulness of it. Go back to Song of Myself passage, Salut Amant, such gliding wonders. He loves this word gliding. Gliding out, I wandered off by myself. Of course, Wordsworth, wandered lonely as a cloud, comes to mind, and many have seen a correlate there at 3a. Notice he's off by himself. So he leaves sitting in the room with all the other listeners, with the applauding listeners, right? Whitman as alone. And so much of Leaves of Grass is really, go back to so many poems. I mean, afoot and lighthearted, I take to the open road, healthy, free, the world before me. There's such an aloneness, that a celebration of the individual here. Off by myself. And then, of course, to the mystical, moist night air. Go back in Song of Myself, passage 20, to find his use of this word mystical. He loves this word. The word what? Means magical, powerful, because there's an insight there that's epiphany-driven. Into the moist night air, and from time to time. Now, much has been made of this idea of time to time, because of course what we're doing when we see the light of stars is in fact experiencing time from long, long ago. So this idea of time to time, as I've said to you guys before, I think T.S. Eliot was very influenced by an idea like this when he sits down to write, for example, the opening lines of Burnt Norton, as we've quoted them many times in these lectures. Time present and time past are both perhaps present and time future, and time future contained in time past, right? He says, from time to time, I looked up, notice the elided verb of look, just like the elided adjective of learned. I looked up in perfect silence at the stars. Now, I think the key word of the entire poem is the word perfect. In other words, perfection in nature, and this will sound very much like Thoreau's Walden, right? Perfection in nature is best understood in that mystical moment of simply one-to-one correlation, one-to-one insight, one-to-one experience, when in perfect silence he's able to see the stars for what they truly are. Again, go back to our reading of Eidolons to play around with this idea. Well, when you take this poem in its total, what is it that really Whitman is trying to argue at level 2A? Well, I think he is arguing for a pedagogy that is experiential. And this is the challenge, of course, of reading Leaves of Grass. It's not just that we're reading it. We're trying to somehow encounter it. We're trying to somehow engage with it, right? And all great learning is this way. Meeting, of course, fear and pain, no question about that. Back to our Plato's Republic, Book 7, the cave allegory. But always trying to grow through the experience, beyond the teacher. That is to say, of course, to destroy the teacher. Song of Myself, passage 47. He most honors my style and learns under to destroy the teacher. At 2B, I love the way in which the syllables start out noisy and end so beautifully quiet. It's a wonderful poem to read out loud. For those of you that have young children, I always recommend this as one of those poems to read out loud. And as you get to the end of the poem, when you read out loud, notice how their physical bodies begin to kind of relax. If read well, this poem will play that game. Now, there are so many references I've already made at 3A, but I would challenge you to go back and look at Emerson's American Scholar. I think Whitman was on to something with Emerson's American Scholar. He knew that lecture that was given at Harvard, that young Thoreau was sitting at, and it had such an influence on Thoreau as well. We've given a full lecture on it at learnstrong.net. You can go find it there. Finally, at 3B, how do you own a poem like this? How do you make it your own? How can you, if you will, walk out of the lecture room and look at the poem in perfect silence? To what degree do you understand how you learn? I think this is one of those poems that I love to teach to students because it does challenge them to think about. How do you learn material? Yes, of course, we have to have some information introduced to us often through lecturing, no question. But the greatest learning is when we engage with ideas in our own way. Some of us are going to enjoy reading Leaves of Grass, not because it's assigned, but because we've decided on our own to pick it up and to walk out into the mystical night air and to look up in joy and just be blown away by what Whitman is arguing. I hope that's you. Thank you.